Hello, everybody. Michael Silber here, event director for Enlit Australia. Um, uh, Continuing with our series of interviews with industry leaders and industry thought leaders. And today I'm really happy to have with us Thomas Briault, who is with Arup, and he is the energy leader for Southeast Asia. And he's also the co-chair of the Hydrogen Committee for the Independent Power Producers Forum. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Michael. Good to see you again.
It's always a pleasure indeed. So let's begin the conversation. Could you just talk in a very general sense about the role of hydrogen in building a decarbonized future?
Sure. So I think the challenge that the world has seen to date with decarbonisation is really around how it goes beyond electricity generation, which renewable energy is sort of forging ahead with and creating very low cost renewable electricity. But that electricity is hard to transport great distances. The electricity markets, I would call them quite local, and by local I mean country specific, both in terms of cost but also in terms of how they're generated, whereas a truly global energy market would be something like oil, which is traded, there's one price and everyone understands it. And the challenge with electricity is really it's hard to store and it's hard to transport, and so hydrogen offers an opportunity of transporting energy great distances and potentially also to places where renewable energy resource is low. So it can be produced in a number of ways. It can be produced, as you know, either from green hydrogen, so that's from renewable electricity, or from reforming a fossil fuel and capturing the CO2 and storing that. Mm-hmm. And so that's the sort of two colors of hydrogen. There are pros and cons of both, which perhaps we could get into, but obviously the oil and gas industry are particularly interested in blue hydrogen because it's a continuation of their existing business and offers them a way to decarbonize while maintaining their upstream businesses.
Yeah, speaking of I suppose the oil and gas industry here in Australia, there's been a lot of talk about creating a hydrogen export market similar to what they've done with LNG. And do you envision that there will be that hydrogen can become a globally traded energy source?
I think, in short, I think there are limitations to it. It's a bit like, well, it is a gas, obviously, but it's similar to the gas market. So if we're talking oil being a truly global market and electricity being a local market, quite country specific, then gas is somewhere in between, right? So LNG is traded a bit in terms of the overall volume of gas globally, but typically gas is a continental thing, so it's a regional thing. You know, Russia has pipelines into Europe. There are pipelines around other parts of the world, like North America, for example. But traditionally, that has stayed as a regional thing, and that is essentially for a similar reason to hydrogen, but with hydrogen it's more acute. There's an energy and a cost penalty associated with compressing gas into liquefied natural gas and then decompressing it. Mm-hmm. And so it's more expensive to produce than gas itself. And the same applies with hydrogen. In fact, as we may come on to, the hydrogen energy penalty from the creation of hydrogen to its conversion into a transportable fuel has a much bigger energy penalty than LNG, and therefore I think it was likely to be actually traded quite locally, only where people really struggle with renewable energy resource or the variable nature of that resource, you know, night and day, or windy and not windy.
Yeah, you and I have spoken in another context about the costs involved with hydrogen, and I believe your feeling is that the costs might be a impediment to developing hydrogen business. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's going to happen anyway, but I think it will be driven by where it develops will be driven by its cost. So there are certain regions of the world. So here in Southeast Asia, for example, there are lots of countries which are still developing their energy markets, and their focus is much more on electrification and security of supply rather than on decarbonisation. Whereas Europe have got quite sophisticated energy markets, and obviously North America have got quite sophisticated energy markets where those problems have been largely overcome. And now the challenge is decarbonisation, and the focus there with all the zero carbon targets is going to be on how we can achieve that. So great penetration of renewables, feed-in tariffs for those, but where there is a variability of that resource, so whether it's windy or whether it's night or day, hydrogen is going to play a quite significant role, as we've seen for some big announcements from Germany, from the Netherlands, from the UK about how much they're supporting it. So I think what is likely to happen is the rest of the world will be driven by a feed-in tariff or a carbon border tax or a carbon price, which will unlock hydrogen. But as it currently stands, the energy penalty associated with hydrogen means it's just not cost effective unless you value that carbon reduction.
Mm. Can you expand on, you've touched on this, but can you expand on if there is a role for hydrogen to play as a power generation fuel?
Certainly. I think, in fact, my personal belief is it's one of the major uses for hydrogen. There's clearly long-term transportation or long-distance heavy haulage transportation where it's likely to be first used. So heavy trucking, shipping, and potentially also aviation, where I think it's likely to be first adopted at large scale. But then I think its secondary use will be in the backup supply, the peaking plant, which is currently, even in sophisticated decarbonized economies like, say, the UK, that's still provided by natural gas. And so the only decarbonization mechanism for that, to deal with the peakiness of a winter evening when everyone turns on their heating, their lights, and they need some form of supply, and the sun has gone down, and it happens not to be blowing, that's when I think a hydrogen storage and hydrogen peaking plant will come in. I think as a mainstream generation fuel, that energy penalty means it won't be used as a mainstream fuel. I think it will be as a backup to renewable electricity supply.
Okay, so expanding on that, you're saying that hydrogen can bridge the gap between demand and intermittency as it relates to renewable power?
Yeah, absolutely. And many people have talked about hydrogen. There's a lot of work in the UK for hydrogen use for heat. We have in the UK something like 90% of homes have a gas boiler, a natural gas boiler, and the question is, how do we decarbonize that? And so people have been talking about using hydrogen for heat, but the energy penalty is so great that it might be simpler to go with electrification, and then, exactly as you say, bridge the gap between intermittency or variability of renewable energy supply. I prefer that term because most things are fairly predictable. When the sun comes up and when it goes down is very predictable. Cloud cover makes a difference, but it doesn't cut solar supply to nothing. So it's about planning that and storing for those downtimes that I think hydrogen plays a role.
So there's lots of talk about investment into hydrogen technologies. Could you give our audience some of your thinking on what technologies are going to be developed earliest as it relates to the hydrogen market?
Sure. So as I said, I think hydrogen offers a great opportunity for the oil and gas industry. We must remember that renewable energy supply is about 10% of global supply. So 90% of energy supply is from some fossil technology. And we need to engage that industry. We need to use that industry. We need to use its capability, and we need to use its huge investment power to create an energy transition towards a zero carbon future. So I think that, coupled with the fact that currently green electricity is green hydrogen is 2 or 3 times the price of blue hydrogen. I think those two things mean that carbon capture and storage and blue hydrogen generation technologies that capture lots of carbon. So, steam methane reformation actually only produces a 60% CO2 waste stream, if you like. The rest of the CO2 goes up the flue, the chimney, and capturing that is quite a challenge. So there'll be lots of technologies looking at better ways of reforming fossil fuels. I think there'll also be lots of work in CCS, and there is lots of work ongoing. And the challenge with that is that, no company can really guarantee CO2 capture in perpetuity. And so that involves governments. So we're seeing that with, the Northern Lights project in Norway, for example, where the Norwegian government is heavily involved. And I think governments are going to have to start getting involved in CCS. I do think that, of course, as the cost of renewable electricity continues to fall, and the cost of electrolyzers begin to fall significantly, the penalty associated, so there's a big capex associated with buying an electrolyzer, which for 16 hours a day when the sun isn't shining isn't being used, or isn't shining enough to be an excess supply. But as those costs come down, just as we've seen with solar panels, for example, photovoltaic panels, I think the cost of green hydrogen will start to fall significantly. So, electrolyzers and those sorts of technologies will come, but I think the first movers are likely to be blue hydrogen, and then of course it's the transport, right? So, can shipping move quickly? I think shipping needs to skip out natural gas as a fuel for shipping and move straight to hydrogen. But so there's some technology there that needs to be developed, and the same is with aviation. I think fuel cells for trucking are there, and the cost just will continue to come down. But we're looking at some of the more exceptional longer distance travel that perhaps there's opportunities for further development.
Well, Thomas, I really appreciate your insights. It's great stuff. Exciting business, hydrogen.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed talking to you about it. So I want to thank you for your time. Hope to see you down here in Australia in March. March 10th and 11th is our live event. And I'd love to talk to you about speaking down here, but we'll touch base on that a little later on. So again, thanks for your time. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Michael. Good to see you.